Hello, and welcome to History's 202. This is our online lecture on the history of the slave trade. And I want to talk to you today about a number of these specific aspects. Um, the transatlantic slave trade is going to go on for 400, 500 years, in some, well, 450 years. And it is going to be transformative for a number of reasons. The Atlantic slave trade is going to create the African diaspora, and a diaspora is the forced migrations of people from one to the other, one place to another place. The Atlantic slave trade represents the largest diaspora in world history, and that's significant enough. But the Atlantic slave trade is also the foundation for the growth of our current economic system, capitalism. It is also going to contribute to the creation of new biracial categories that the world had never seen. It is also going to become the basis for laws, categories of race, and a whole new social cast that is also based on race. So the Atlantic slave trade is fundamental for really understanding how the rest of the modern world is going to develop. In our course, we also look at the slave trade as being foundational for the growth of the Industrial Revolution, which is also forthcoming. You might also look at this from the environmental perspective and the access to sugar and what access to sugar, how it corrodes other parts of the world. So keep all of that in the back of your mind as we move through this lecture today. A couple things to note about the development of transatlantic slavery. There had been a steady stream of trade going on that existed between Africa and Europe prior to this point in time. The trans-Saharan trade, for example, which was facilitated by Bedouin and other nomadic peoples of North Africa, Muslims of North Africa, had existed for hundreds of years. So there had been certainly contact between Europeans and particularly West Africans, but other part of Africa prior to 1500. In fact, if you go back, there is a black, or rather Muslim invasion of Europe that starts hundreds of years before, that creates a numerous sort of divisions within the Iberian Peninsula of Spain and Portugal. And I say that because as the Spanish and the Portuguese are going to force out what was known as the Moorish or African Muslims who invaded them, they are going to come back into Africa and start to have real recalcitrant ideas about race and the development of what we would call pronounced racial ideologies, and most effectively known as white supremacy. But these encounters, again, go back hundreds and hundreds of years. But Europeans will begin coming to Africa beginning in the 1500s in very large numbers. Again, Africans had traveled to Europe. We start to see the opposite happening at this point in time. And one of the things, obviously, the Europeans will see is that Africans did engage in the practice of slavery. Now, slavery in Africa has an incredibly long history going back to the earliest examples of civilizations in Egypt and other parts of the Nile Valley. However, slavery was defined in very different ways, as will legally it will be defined throughout colonies, European colonies of the Western Hemisphere. Was it permanent? No. The answer to that is African enslavement as practiced throughout civilizations across Africa, was not a permanent institution. One could become assimilated into the broader society. One could be emancipated, and there were mechanisms for doing this. There was also a number of ways that enslavement occurred in Africa. Most of these things were judicial, as a punishment for breaking some sort of law. There were examples of voluntary slavery in that you would basically sign up with a military force, and then if you won land, you might get some of it, and thus becoming a free person. I bring all of this up because this pattern in history of enslavement in Africa is very much going to be used to justify what Europeans are doing and how long that they engage in the practice. So they pinpoint and they say, look, Africans did it, so it's okay if we do it, without much acknowledgement of the transformative ways that they are going about engaging in the process. Okay. As you can start to see, the Portuguese also, right in that Iberian Peninsula I spoke of before, are some of the first European nation states to begin sailing around. And there are a couple of very good reasons for that. Now, I told you that black Moors or Muslims had invaded the Iberian Peninsula, and then for some length of time, they are trying to force these invaders out. Now, if you are in Portugal and you want access to, I don't know, let's just pick something, sugar, for example, that you could get in certain parts of Asia, also in West Africa, there are a couple of ways to get there. You can walk, right? But if you're going to do that, you're going to come in very close contact with Muslims, and they don't really want to do that. You could also walk overland to China and India, and they don't want to do that either because they're Muslims here. So one of the reasons to take to the seas is to get around Muslims occupying very large parts of land that they want to get around to. So there is a great marriage of sort of science, much of the science that they actually got from Muslims, and trying to avoid those same people in terms of trying to get to resources. As I mentioned, I will repeat back numerous times, the Portuguese and other European nation states, even at this time, are seeing pronounced environmental changes in terms of their resources. And they need access to food, certainly to wood, to build things. Resources are critical. So that is the motivation for colonization as well. It will get wrapped up into Christianity as well as other imperatives, but money and resources still remain critical for any colonization, regardless of what period we're looking at. Okay. So when we also start looking at the colonization of the Western Hemisphere and the Americas, it also, again, is worth our time to spend looking at just the vastness of the Caribbean and the different islands that are there. Of course, the Arawak and other indigenous peoples are all here before the arrival of Europeans. And of course, it was possible for West Africans to make the trip and sail across the ocean long before Columbus. And there's lots of evidence to suggest they did. The difference is West Africans are not going to colonize and build colonies. They would stay and sail back. It's very possible the Chinese had also been doing this, but also not building colonies. So when we start to see this sort of rate of interaction, we already know that due to the Columbian exchange, the arrival of Europeans will have devastating effects on the indigenous populations here. However, for those who are surviving, they are also then creating these new racial categories, some through marriage, mostly through rape, called Creoles, and that is the new racial category that defines indigenous, European, and African descent. All right. When we think about the development of capitalism and the practice of private wealth, right, that's going to be based on the practice of plantation agriculture. And plantation agriculture is growing food for profit, or other commodities. So the specific foods / commodities that are going to create the most revenue across colonies in the Western Hemisphere are sugar and tobacco. Now, sugar was something that Europeans did not have indigenous to their, not sugar cane, to their environments. You could get sugar through honey, through fruit, right? But sugar cane was something that you could not get in Europe. You can get it in Southeast Asia. It's one of the reasons to try to access Chinese markets, is to get access to sugar. Tobacco will also be a luxury item, right? You don't need tobacco to survive. Tobacco is indigenous to the Western Hemisphere. So think about these two things together. Sugar will become omnipotent and ever present in the foods of Europeans, and certainly will be central to the development of American food manufacturing. Sugar is going to become the prominent cash crop across Western Hemisphere. For a place like Brazil, more enslaved Africans are going to be forced into sugar production, and then coffee, right, to feed this sort of insatiable hunger for sugar. So we should really pause and consider the relationship between sugar and enslavement, and how this want of this sweet nectar, if you will, which will again become fundamental to alcohol consumption, right? You have the creations of new alcohol that are mostly sugar, that like rum, that people continue to drink 600 years later. Sugar in our food, sugar sweets, it's really foundational. So we should remember the sort of the human cost of what the sugar, and environmental cost of what the sugar production is going to yield. And of course, West Africans did have some sugar cane. They understood its production, ways to harvest it, and as again those Europeans from the Iberian Peninsula, the Spanish and the Portuguese, are beginning to trade with West Africa. This is something that they want, and will also become a justification for greater numbers of enslavement. This is a summation of what I was just speaking of, right? The human cost of sugar, the indigenous location in West Africa, and then, of course, how it becomes a central part of capitalism, enslavement, the Industrial Revolution, and further colonization to get sugar. And many of the sugar companies that developed hundreds of years ago are still very much around. So their origins and genesis lie in slave labor. And you might even look it up if you buy sugar, how long they've been around, and if you can trace their practices back to this. As some you can. As you remember from your text and future, in past readings, the Spanish, and Columbus being one of them, are going to arrive on the island of Hispaniola and other parts of the Bahamas and Jamaica in around 1500. The Bahamas, of course, being much farther north, but also travel around the Caribbean. And we will also see an early arrival of those that the Spanish and the Portuguese are bringing over as slaves. Some of the very first arrivals in the Western Hemisphere. The particulars of the Middle Passage, or the actual part of this larger triangular trade going on between Europe, Africa, and the Western Hemisphere, this specific part of that included human capital and humans, is the Middle Passage. And what you see right here on the right is a picture of Elmina, the first Portuguese trading post that's built on the coastline of West Africa in 1482. And it was a jail, a holding cell for those Africans that have been bartered with Europeans, for other things, such as guns, mostly, and other sort of put together goods. And because of this, you could also, as other scholars do, make the argument that there is civil wars breaking out now amongst those who are capturing Africans for trade and sale to Europeans and profiting off of this. So it's creating civil wars across African kingdoms. And what starts in West Africa and then slowly starts to involve other parts of southern Africa, long into territories down into South Africa. The voyage itself took approximately 16 weeks, so that's around 4 months. And the voyage began in Elmina right here with brandings and physical inspections. Obviously, the ideal enslaved person was a young man, physically strong and healthy. So you had an initial branding of human skin by hot irons that began the process and whether or not one was inspected and had been looked at. The ships themselves were symbols of human horror, having little room for air, no mechanisms to expel human waste, certainly no mechanisms to detract from vermin and other animals that live in human filth. So, a number of hardships, food that was rotted or no food at all, and also the reality of sailing, which is having boats being knocked off course, being subject to violent storms along the sea, and even the interpersonnel intrigue of white slave captains who were notoriously morally bankrupt anyway with corrupt crews. So you had a number of inhumane practices that would have been on board the numerous 36,000 voyages that took place across the Atlantic, as well as the tens of thousands of voyages that took place just among Western Hemisphere colonies themselves. Speaking to this, then the mortality rate on board was about 10 to 20%. So you have more people getting on than getting off due to all of these various inhumane factors. As I mentioned before, the Atlantic slave trade, the part of human cargo is known as the Middle Passage. But if I link this together, it makes a triangle. So you would have manufactured or semi-manufactured goods being sent to Europe for manufacturing. Those goods taken to these different ports. What starts as just Elmina alone becomes other European ports along West Africa where you have trade going on. Europeans are bringing those items and exchanging them and trading them for humans and then taking them to different ports in Western Hemisphere where then those people will be separated, certainly families broken apart, and intentionality in terms of trying to break humans down as much as possible. What are the consequences of all of this for Africa? We want to begin there because you really start to see what our historians call the spiral of violence across different kingdoms as a result of these practices. There are certainly a number of examples where there are civil wars breaking out over this. One is in the Kingdom of the Congo. It traced its origins back to around the 1300s. Alfonso I, who is one of the kings of his region, again known as Congo, converts to Catholicism, is converted by missionaries who were there, and takes a very hard stance against enslaving others to Portuguese traders. Eventually, his kingdom is overrun by the Portuguese due to their resistance against it and unwillingness to cooperate. The Asantes also represent another place where we would have seen both members of this clan engage in the slave trade as well as fight against it. And of course, in the Congo, women warriors were often the ones leading the practices and war against Europeans. And there are numerous examples of that, and you will focus on some of those, as you've already seen in the previous discussion. When we're also looking at the impact, right, and the growth of the diasporic African population, it's important to understand where enslaved Africans are being colonized geographically. And as you can see, only 5% of this population ends up in British North America, or what will become the United States. The majority, obviously, are in Brazil. So Brazil, you really see the longest lasting effects and the largest numbers of enslaved Africans in the Western Hemisphere. The British West Indies, these again are places like Jamaica, about 22%. The French West Indies, that would be Haiti, 20%, and then Spanish America is 13%. So there is, numbers still are in approximations, but it's roughly about 15 to 20 million who are displaced and enslaved during the diaspora. Life in the New World is a world filled with hardship, horror, violence, rape, and unknowing, and again, experiencing some of the most horrific human horrors in human history. The life in the New World began with being sold into an environment where you would not know anyone. You may not speak the same language. You may or may not have any similarities amongst the other enslaved population and community of which you're now in. There is also, this is a subset of this is called the scramble. And again, this is the very intentional practice of removing people who were family, removing people who spoke similar language as a disorienting mechanism. Again, so it tries to minimize contact with others, and this is intentional. Along with that is something called seasoning, a violence, a psychological, physical breakdown of humans that was trying to enforce conformity, would try to enforce not resisting enslavement, and that included language, and of course it included violent discipline. In terms of the actual work, this varied depending on colony, but as mentioned earlier, many Africans will find themselves enslaved in sugar mills in terms of not only harvesting the sugar cane, but processing it in these early manufacturing centers. They're not really factories yet, but they are manufacturing, breaking this down so it can be shipped across to Europe. The Caribbean is also mostly doing that, and then in the sugar mines, silver and gold mines across Peru, Mexico, and in certain places in the Caribbean. As anticipated, resistance is occurring on a daily basis. So when we talk about either the history of indigenous enslavement or African enslavement in the Western Hemisphere, resistance is a critical part of the story, right? Resistance is how people are fighting back. And certainly there are the examples of rebellions, and rebellions are harder to do as they take organization, they take leadership, they take a plan. But people resisted every day, and everyday acts of resistance are poisoning, right? Taking small tools, maybe even not enough poison to kill, just to give someone the worst stomach upset of their life. There are examples of slowing the work down, of breaking tools. There are examples of bringing work to a very slow moving pitch. There are examples of resistance as feigning you don't understand how to do it, right? So these are small mechanisms or small avenues people find on a daily basis. Also, even helping others escape, and that can be through physically, through showing maps, and this is also was done through hair and braiding as a sort of language of resistance. Quilting often told stories and gave clues as to how to do this, as well as music, drumming, singing. So we can find all of these daily acts of resistance. And we can also find certainly episodes of rebellions that were consistent throughout our time period. Suicide, mass suicide, was certainly something that was practiced by indigenous peoples as well as by Africans. Large scale suicides also took place on slave ships, as did rebellions, right, where you had the people on board take over the crew. So all of these are examples and worth knowing about. You also have the development of in every. So I mentioned before, right, over here, this is a map of, of the different European nation states that are going to colonize the Caribbean and other parts of Western Hemisphere. French, the Spanish, the English, the Dutch, the Danish, as well as the Portuguese that aren't listed here. So they're fighting each other back in Europe, and they're all fighting each other over here for colonies. And it also means that in all of these different languages, French, Spanish, Dutch, English, Portuguese, that there is a word for runaways. And if there's a word for a runaway enslaved African in every European language, then it tells us that this was a common occurrence. So you have, and this isn't on there, but in Portuguese, the term quilimbo. Sorry about that. Let me show you its spelling. Was used to describe runaway people and even a runaway colony. In England and in the English language, they're going to be called maroons. In Spanish, they're going to be called cimarrones. So there's a term for this across European languages. And it gives us lots of insight into the problem of maintaining people as slaves in this environment over this expansive period of time. And some of the earliest examples of rebellions, of slave rebellions, happened along the islands of Georgia in 1590 as the Spanish brought Africans over to try to settle islands between Georgia and South Carolina. That was 1526. The example here is of Yanga, who leads a African rebellion in Mexico and I believe Cuba around 1608. But one of the earliest examples happens along coastal Georgia, and I believe the date is 1526. For your assignment this week, you are going to look at this information on slave voyages, which is an excellent collection of primary documents that was compiled by a number of universities and academic sources. So there will be a short explanation of that to review as well. Please let me know if you have any questions about this particular history, and we're going to go more into how this plays out socially, economically, legally, politically next week as well. Thank you.